Mr. Kadams.
Thank you, Judge. Good morning. On behalf of Mr. Bourgoin, thank you for being here to finally hear about what was really going on back in October of 2016. You are all the deciders of the facts, the ones that will hear the evidence and decide. We look forward to the opportunity to explain it to you, to tell you all the facts, all the information. On October 8, 2016, Stephen Bourgoin drove north in the South Main lane of I-89 and slammed into a Jetta Volkswagen, killing the 5 teenagers. That is what happened. That is something that this trial will never change. The accident killed those children, and it's hard to even think about. Those 5 taken from life, their families, it's not fair. It's unjust, it's unthinkable. But this trial, however, is not about whether or not Stephen Bourgoin drove his truck the wrong way on 89 and hit the Jetta and killed them. It did. That's the hard truth. This trial is about why it happened. What was going on in Stephen Bourgoin's head on that tragic night back in October of 2016? Why in the world would he do such a thing? The evidence will be that Stephen Bourgoin was totally psychotic and delusional at the time of the crash. The evidence will be that he was, in every sense, insane at the time of the crash. All the evidence points to that conclusion. There will be testimony from 2 psychiatrists who will tell you that Stephen Bourgoin was suffering from a mental disease at the time of the crash that caused him to be psychotic and delusional. And due to being psychotic and delusional, the actions were done when he couldn't conform his conduct to the requirements of law or appreciate the criminality of what he's doing. That is legally insane. To find Stephen was insane at the time, you need to know a lot about him. You need to know his full history, and we intend to present it to you. We have opened the book on Stephen, so you can fully evaluate him. His personal history, his medical history, his marital history, all his records, interviews with his families, his friends, his workmates, his neighbors, a microscopic view of his goings and comings the week before the crash. Phone records, computer records, cell tower tracking records. You will hear all of it. This is the evidence you must hear to judge the validity of the insanity defense. But just because you're hearing a lot about Stephen Bourgoin doesn't mean that those 5 children didn't die, or that it wasn't his truck that crashed into him. It did. That's not, again, in dispute. By talking a lot about Stephen Bourgoin, he is not denying the actions that caused their deaths. We are not going to be talking a lot about Stephen Bourgoin because we think he's important and the children aren't. We need to talk about Stephen Bourgoin so you can judge, as the judges of the facts, the validity of the insanity defense. As I said, when you insert the insanity defense, your life becomes an open book. You'll hear that Mr. Bourgoin was examined by 3 psychiatrists, a psychologist. He signed all sorts of releases for medical records, correctional records, therapy records, and the psychiatrist talked with him for hours and hours and asked him all sorts of questions about his background, his history, and his mental functioning at or around the time of the crash. Ultimately, Dr. David Rosemarin from McLean Hospital, which is associated with Harvard University, who was hired by the defense, and Dr. Reena Kapoor, who is affiliated with Yale University and was hired by the state in this case, concluded that Stephen Bourgoin was legally insane at the time of the offense. The psychiatrist who the state chose as being highly respected and highly qualified looked at the records, did 3 long interviews with Mr. Bourgoin, and ultimately concluded that he was psychotic and delusional at the time of the crash, such that he couldn't appreciate the criminality of his conduct or conform his actions to the requirements of the law. That is legally insane. I will go through all the details of how Stephen Bourgoin descended into a state where he became psychotic and delusional on October 8th, 2016. It's going to take some time, so I hope you'll be patient with me. The evidence is clear that Stephen was depressed for years. He'd experienced years of mood swings and deteriorated psychiatrically in the weeks before the crash. In the days before the crash, he became more and more delusional, thinking he was seeing or getting some sort of messages about a government mission he was to participate in. Or perhaps he had inadvertently stumbled upon something on the internet that he wasn't supposed to see, and then he was in danger. He had been on the internet a lot that week, looking at things like the NSA and missile silos, and he felt like things may have been jumping out at him or connecting to him. And that on October 8th, he drove that truck while delusional, psychotic, and confused. So first I want to tell you a little bit about Stephen's background. He was born in New Hampshire, raised in Newburyport, Massachusetts. His family moved 5 times before he was 12. At age 10, his house burned down, his dog died. At age 12, his parents divorced, and he moved with his mom to Massachusetts, but she died when he was 13. He had instability in his life that continued, and he had to go live with a maternal aunt for a while. He had anxiety as a child that was consistent with undiagnosed ADHD, and he then lived on his own a bit when he was in 9th grade, eventually moved to Rutland, Vermont, where his father was a high school football coach. He played football. He functioned fairly well in high school. He was on some championship football teams. But his father and stepmother had issues with him, and he ended up living on his own in his senior year. While in his senior year, he enlisted in the Army. And he went into the Army after graduation, where he excelled. He had basic training, but he was medically discharged for an eye condition after basic training. And he was bitterly disappointed by this. After that, he worked in some jobs in New Hampshire and Massachusetts, and then moved back to the Burlington area in 2007. He had continued to have anxiety and would have racing thoughts and sleepless nights. And then in 2008, after a breakup with his then-girlfriend, he developed a major depression. He saw doctors for the depression. He was prescribed Prozac. And then later, in 2008, he met Anila Lawrence, at a wedding of a mutual friend, and they started dating soon thereafter. I'm going to go through, because the relationship with Ms. Lawrence is important, I want to go through it with you. So, again, in 2008, they meet. And through 2008, until 2013, Neela reports that Stephen's very happy. They have fun together, they go out, he's active. They eventually buy a condominium in Williston. He's working, Stephen, as in the shipping, I believe, at Logic Supply as a purchaser. And he's got ambition. He's got ambition to go back to school and to get a good degree. So that's for the 5 years or so, that's what's going on. Then in June of 2013, coincidentally the same day that Stephen was going to propose to Anila, she tells him that Izzy is born, their daughter, in February, and Ms. Lawrence will tell you the mood swings continue, and she keeps seeing changes. Gets to the point where Stephen quits his job, and he doesn't want to work, and he stays home with Izzy. In July, they had wedding plans. They had bridesmen and bridesmaids. They had a wedding planned. And all of a sudden, Stephen one day freaks out and cancels everything. Calls everybody up and just says, I don't want to do this. And Anila again saying it was like a real mental breakdown, and that he was too confused to even know what was going on. By fall, Stephen's saying, let's rent out our condo and move down to Massachusetts, but with no real plan to him, and the red light was put there for a reason. He's driving around now at night when, instead of sleeping, he's getting out in his truck and he's driving around at night, and he's driving by an ATM and the green light will be on, and he'll think that meant for him to drive through there. And he'll drive through there and he'll look on the screen and there'll be words on the screen having to do with the government, and that somehow that message was for him. And he's doing this throughout the day on Tuesday and Wednesday. He looks at his passport. He's got his passport. Information within his passport that are for him. And he thinks that there's someone somehow trying to connect with him. On Thursday, he goes to work at Lake Champlain's Chocolates and the crossword puzzle. He looks at the crossword puzzle and he thinks there's words in the crossword puzzle that are meant for him. He thinks it's some government agency trying to connect with him. The FBI, the state police, NSA, something trying to connect with him. And by Thursday into Friday, he's not sleeping at all. He's thinking two different things. In the beginning, he's excited. This is his dream come true. He's being selected for some type of mission, for some type of government-sponsored mission. He got discharged from the Army, but now he's being selected. So now Thursday into Friday, he doesn't sleep at all Thursday night into Friday. But he doesn't feel fatigued. He feels energetic. He's bolder. He's excited. He's thinking again that this might be a dream come true. We know that at 2 a.m. he texts his friend Asima, "You're awake, you can't sleep tonight." He's up all night. By noontime at Lake Champlain's Chocolates, he leaves work. He intends to come back, but he leaves work and he starts driving. And he ends up driving south on 116 towards Heinsberg. He's again getting directions, subtle directions from his radio. He thinks at this point, this may be the extraction. This may be where he's going to meet the folks. And he drives out there and there's nothing. There's nothing there. There's nobody there. Again, he then is toggling between excitement and paranoia. He starts to think, well, maybe it's not a mission. Maybe I stumbled upon something on the internet I shouldn't have. And they're going to trick me to get me somewhere, and they're going to harm me. And so he is going between these two things, and he doesn't know. You'll hear that that trip out down south is confirmed by his telephone records. At work, so then he eventually calls Lake Champlain's Chocolate, or they call him, and he quits. And this is totally bizarre behavior. He doesn't have a job. He doesn't have anything lined up. By Friday night, things really start to go in an insane, bizarre direction. By Friday night, he's getting directions to go to somewhere, and he follows those directions, and he ends up in a cornfield by the river in Essex by the airport. And he thinks, again, he's got to follow the directions, the communications, through either his cell phone or the car, parks his truck, goes into the woods, and he's excited. Again, he thinks he's headed somewhere. He thinks at some point he's being watched. He hears something like a helicopter, thinks maybe it's a drone, but he gets to the cornfield, and there's the moon shining down the path of the cornfield, and he thinks that this is it. This is the path. It's for me. And so he continues to go down that path, and he heads towards the river, and he gets to the river, and he's there, and he believes he's getting the message to disarm. So he's got a knife with him, a K-bar knife. He's had it for 20 years, and he throws it in the river. And then he goes back up towards his truck, and he hears some noises, thinks he's being watched, but then he ends up going back down towards the river, and all of a sudden there's a circular tunnel just for him. He believes it's there, and he crawls through it. It's too good to be true. How could this all be laid out for him? He gets to the water, and he felt like the direction at that point to him was to get in the water, that he was supposed to get in the water. But he doesn't do it. He's scared. He thinks, wait, this is where they're going to kill me. He thought it was all a setup at this point. Again, toggling back and forth between exhilaration and paranoia. He hears big splashes in the water. Thinks maybe there are Navy SEALs in the water that are there. And so he's completely out of his mind. And he takes his phone and he smashes it on a rock and he throws it in the river. He gets back to his truck. He drops a water cap bottle on the ground. He's frantic about it because he thinks part of what's going on is he's not supposed to leave a trace behind, and somehow he's failing this mission. But he gets back in his truck, he turns the radio on, and the radio music is telling him he's successfully completed what happened. So he feels more relieved. He is completely and utterly psychotic and delusional, paranoid, completely out of touch with reality. And all of this is confirmed by his cell phone records. His cell phone records show that on Friday night, he's out at Cornfield, out in Essex, by the airport. He gets there at 7:36, and by 8:42, the phone goes dead. That phone's never heard from again. He smashed it, and he threw it in the river. He goes home, he washes his clothes, and then he's out driving again. By 4 a.m., he's stopping by, now we're into Saturday morning of the crash. He stops by the Kosovic's house at 4 a.m. No reason to stop by at 4 a.m. They're asleep. He wakes them up. He's talking about things with them. He's pacing about. They say, do you want to stay here? He says no, and he leaves. They're concerned about him. By 8 a.m., 8:40 a.m., he is an hour and 20 minutes from when he's to see Izzy again. Plenty of time to get to Essex, plenty of time for his visit, but he doesn't go there. Where does he go? He goes to the hospital. He goes to the hospital, and he parks his truck, he gets into the hospital, and he's first discovered in the hospital within the secure portion of the ER, not the reception area, but somehow he's made it past the reception area, and he's standing within the emergency department itself, and a nurse comes out of a break room and notices him, and he's staring at the wall, staring at a poster, not moving. He doesn't get out of the way when she's come, and she says, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "I'm okay. I'm fine." And this is bizarre behavior. So she calls security, and she asks security to come get rid of this guy. He's not supposed to be in here, and they do. They come and they tell him to leave, but he doesn't. He goes out into the reception area of the emergency department, and he's staring at some posters up the wall. He's seeing messages and images. Things are speaking to him, and he's looking at them, and he just does that. And security, who's now started to watch this odd behavior, sees him, a different security guard. They have a camera, and there's video of this. You'll see. It's completely corroborated. Comes out and says, again, what are you doing here? Why are you here? Do you need help? And he's like, no, I'm just reading the sign. Could you write this phone number down for me that's on this sign? I need that phone number. It's a volunteer program for pulmonary research or something like that. Obviously, it has nothing to do with Stephen, but he thinks it's speaking to him, and he needs that number. So they give him the number. He writes down the number, and then he leaves. So again, it's 8:44. He leaves the hospital. He is gone then. Again, plenty of time to get to Essex, but he doesn't go to Essex. By 9:39, he's back in the hospital again. This time, he comes in, he goes into the reception area, and he goes to the check-in. The security sees him, and they're like, that's that odd guy that was here before, and they come out to check on him, but they don't talk to him because instead of just hanging around, he actually goes to the reception area and checks in. He checks in with them, and while we're unclear what our interaction is, he gets coded in as crisis by the reception person. That's the first step at the ER. He's then waiting, and within a couple of minutes he's called in to the triage nurse, which is kind of the next step at the emergency department. And he talks to the triage nurse, and the triage nurse is a little confused. He doesn't really have any complaints. He says he just wants to be somewhere safe. He's having trouble organizing his thoughts. He doesn't say, I'm paranoid and I'm hearing things. Paranoid person say what they're paranoid about? She continues to check him in, has him look at the pain chart, the happy little faces that go from 1 to 10, and he says he doesn't understand it. In fact, he says, which the triage nurse will tell you that happens, but that he then goes on to say, I want you to read the directions to me. And again, doesn't complain, doesn't have a complaint. He says he's stressed out, work, family, but he's not saying I'm delusional or I think I'm on a government mission. He's not telling anybody that. So she takes him to the next step, which is to an emergency department room, and puts him in the room, and again talks to him, leaves him there. A nurse comes in, talks to him, has kind of the same type of conversation with him. He says he just wants to be somewhere safe. There's a discussion that goes on about taking his clothes off and changing. He doesn't want his clothes to be taken. He doesn't want his passport to leave the room. So there's a negotiation, and he's allowed to keep his clothes in the room. He changes into hospital scrubs. He's up on a gurney, a warm blanket put on him, and he's safe. At that point, physician's assistants come in and to talk to him, and again, it's kind of the same thing. Generalized complaints about anxiety, I just want to be safe, specifically denies suicidal ideation, homicidal ideation, delusions, and the PA determines and says to him, you're either going to get admitted or you're going to go. I mean, you just can't hang out in the emergency department. And there's a discussion about leaving the emergency department, and Stephen doesn't want to get admitted. He just wanted to be somewhere safe. And the physician assistant leaves. The notes indicate that there had been a sitter with him, a one-on-one sitter with Stephen, but the nurse, the original nurse, comes back in after the doctor leaves, the physician's assistant leaves, and Stephen's gone. He's gone. So she goes back. The nurse goes back out to the PA and says, "What happened to that guy in the room?" And she says, "Well, I was going to discharge him." She said, "Well, what about his discharge instructions? Should I try to find him?" And she says, "No, it's okay." And so Stephen's gone. He's gone from the hospital. Stephen says he feels tired. He's been up now for days. He remembers going home, possibly sleeping on his couch because he wanted to be able to see his front door. And at some point, he recalls getting up. He recalls it's nighttime. He recalls driving down Route 2, driving in Richmond by the park and ride, going through the park and ride, noticing cameras up on the park and ride, and then getting on the interstate, and doesn't have a memory of driving the wrong way on the interstate, but does have a memory of the crash, and moments before the crash, trying to swerve and avoid a vehicle. He is completely delusional and psychotic at the time of the crash. What he is seeing and feeling isn't there. And then, after the crash, again, completely delusional and psychotic, he gets out of his car, he goes down the embankment, and he looks in the vehicle, and he doesn't see children there at all. He sees what he thinks are mannequins with breathing apparatus on them. He thinks this is a setup. This has all been a setup. So he turns and he goes to leave, and he looks up, or goes down the highway, and there's red lights there, blue lights, lights. I've been communicating. First it was red, now there's blue, and there's a police car, and the police car is just waiting there for him. The door's open and the car's running. It's just there for him. And so he gets in the vehicle and he drives down. He has some memory of turning around and coming back, and then there's a second crash. He suffers massive injuries from the two accidents. His hip is broken. He has multiple fractures of his face. He's near comatose when he gets at the hospital and remains that way for days. When he finally awakes, days later, he's confused, he's paranoid. He doesn't know why there's guards in the room. He's shackled to the gurney. He doesn't know who it is that's coming in to speak with him. There's doctors and lawyers and investigators, and he doesn't know who to trust. He's guarded. He's non-cooperative. On October 14th, 6 days after the crash, he's wheeled into a conference room that's been set up like a courtroom at the hospital and charged with the offenses. Now, soon after that, he's at UVM rehabilitation, and then he's at different facilities, jail facilities throughout Vermont. And through this time, he's interviewed and examined by multiple folks, and I'm going to go take some time and go through them with you. At some point, soon in time after the accident, a month and a half after, he's interviewed by a defense investigator, Jamie Lee Kiley. By December 1st, Dr. Cotton does an interview and exam. Now, Dr. Cotton, as Ms. Harden explained to you, in cases like this, the court orders an evaluation with regard to sanity. And after that, the court issues an order. It gets sent to the Department of Mental Health. The Department of Mental Health has a list of folks that they have under contract to do these evaluations, and Dr. Cotton was the next one up, and he was ordered to do the evaluation. He went to the correctional facility in Southern State down in Springfield and did a 4-hour examination of Mr. Bourgoin. He writes a report on December 9th in which he finds that his reports are consistent with delusional thoughts. Yet he finds them sane at the time of the accident. We came to find out recently that actually he had written a draft report in which Dr. Cotton had said, with respect to mental disease or defect, Stephen Bourgoin may have had an acute psychotic disorder at the time of the alleged offenses. The condition appears to have included active symptoms at the time and would be considered a mental disease. So that was a draft report he wrote after meeting with Mr. Bourgoin. but that's not in his final report at all, and was only discovered recently upon request of Dr. Cotton for any draft report. Importantly, he says his reports are consistent with delusional thoughts, and he doesn't mention anything in his report that Mr. Bourgoin is malingering, faking, making it all up. Somehow this is all a contrivance. Instead, he says his reports are consistent with delusional thoughts, but doesn't think it amounts to, enough to meet the standard. In February of 2018, Dr. David Rosemarin does an exam. He does a second exam, which are all videotaped and audio taped, audio recorded for transparency purposes, and he issues a report in June of 2018 that says that Mr. Bourgoin did suffer from a mental disease or defect at the time of the event, and he was unable to perform his conduct or appreciate the criminality of his offense, or legally insane at the time. Upon receiving that report, the state went out and handpicked Dr. Rina Kapoor to review Dr. Rosemarin's findings. They didn't, again, talk to Dr. Cotton. They hired Dr. Kapoor. She does 1, 2, 3 interviews. She recommends the state hire a psychologist, Dr. Baranowski. I think I spelled her name wrong there. I think it's with an O. Baranowski, who does a psychological evaluation. And then immediately after her last interview, January 25, 2019, when the state had provided Dr. Kapoor more information about the investigation in the case, the cell phone records, any computer records, Facebook messages, things that they wanted Dr. Kapoor to look at, and she wanted to talk to Mr. Bourgoin about them. She goes to the Northwest State Correctional Facility where Mr. Bourgoin is, spends a number of hours with him, and then drives from there to the state's attorney's office and tells them, I think he was suffering from a mental disease or defect at the time of the offense, and that he couldn't appreciate the criminality of his conduct or conform his conduct to the requirements of law. That is, insane at the time of the offense. So the next week, the state says, we're not calling Dr. Kapoor anymore. We're going to hire Dr. Cotton. And we're going to hire him. He's not somebody ordered by the court and working for the Department of Mental Health. We're going to retain him and pay him to be our expert in this case. And they send, subsequent to that, Dr. Kapoor is deposed by the defense, where we do a formal interview of her, and she fleshes out her opinion to us that he was suffering from a mental disease or defect at the time of the offense and unable to appreciate the criminality of his conduct. She differs with Dr. Rosemarin about what that underlying mental disease or defect is, but as far as the standard is concerned, it doesn't matter. They both agree that it is a mental disease or defect that would qualify for the insanity defense, and more importantly, that he was delusional and psychotic and not malingering or making it all up or faking all of this. So then, in March of 2019, after Dr. Cotton reviews additional information, he then gives his deposition, and he doesn't say what he said in his preliminary report, that he had acute psychotic disorder, and he now is backtracking from his reports are consistent with delusional thoughts. He's basically saying, well, I said that, I meant that's what he said. In March of 2019, Dr. Cotton says, I think he's making it all up. I think the whole thing, he had a lot of time to think about it. First he says, he had a lot of time to think about it, and so by February and July, he's been able to talk with other inmates, and he's made this all up. Neglecting that Mr. Bourgoin told this story to Ms. Kiley back in November and to him in December. You will also hear that there's no evidence that intoxication had anything to do with this event, that there's no evidence that suicide had anything to do with this event. He was wearing a seatbelt at the time of the initial crash. And there's no evidence that he's in some type of blind rage, upset about his finances or his child custody. In fact, we know he had just gained visits. He had just gone in and agreed to custody with Anila and gained visits for the first time in 5 or 6 months. The only explanation for what happened is that he completely and totally lost touch with reality.
I apologize, Mr. Camus, I apologize. This is now getting into...
Sidebar, please. If everybody would like to stand up, please, and you can talk quietly amongst each other. Enjoy the view.
I should have told you you can do that. Please be seated. I think we're all set.
The objection is sustained, Your Honor.
The objection is sustained.
Thank you.
Again, the evidence will be that Mr. Bourgoin was psychotic and delusional on the night of October 8, 2016. He thought he was on some type of mission directed by his car radio. He was out of his mind. This is a tragedy. The death of these children, it's horrible. It's beyond words, and that's not in dispute, and we all grieve. But this is a case about evidence, and the evidence is that Stephen Bourgoin was insane at the time of the crash. From Wednesday before the crash, he had descended into a world of illusions and ideas of reference and was totally out of his mind. By the time Saturday night comes, he's psychotic and can't appreciate what he's doing or control his behavior. The evidence you will hear, and this evidence overwhelmingly supports the finding that he was insane at the time. Again, I thank you for your patience in listening to me this morning, and I thank you in advance for listening to the evidence over the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Okay, so as I indicated to you, it's my understanding the attorneys need some time to then set up some of the equipment. It's also perfect timing because we like to take a mid-morning break and a mid-afternoon break because it's just really hard to sit and listen for extended periods of time. So this will be our mid-morning break. We'll stand in recess hopefully for just 15 minutes.
We only need 5 to 10 minutes.
Well, why don't we do this as our morning break, because once we resume, I want to be able